What I would like to do first, well, firstly I'm going to ask everyone to give a brief introduction, and then I want to talk about a particular kind of scenario, which we'll get to shortly after. So, do you want to start, Vannessa?
Hi, I'm Vannessa Hearman. I'm a historian of Southeast Asia, and my main focus area geographically are to do with Indonesia and East Timor, or Timor-Leste. So my research interests are to do with how societies make sense of conflict and violence and the aftermath in particular. So I'm interested in transitional justice and the role of creating new historical narratives through storytelling and through artworks, visual arts, cinema, and so on, how people make sense of violence and how they create a sense of meaning about that experience. So I'm coming at it from a history background and looking at how people cope in the aftermath of violence. So a little bit about me.
I'm Dr. Sky Croeser from Internet Studies, Vague Disciplinary Cloud. My research focuses on how people use but also change and reconfigure key technologies. So in terms of what we're talking about tonight, thinking particularly about the role of platforms in how they represent war and how people whose voices are and aren't represented there. And a lot of my research is focused on activists who are kind of working in dissent against the government, working at building alternative structures, finding new ways to organise at the strata kind of between the individual and the government.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Dr. Ben Rich. I'm from the social science area of the school. My sort of research interests historically have been looking at particularly Saudi authoritarian politics, but also Middle Eastern geopolitics and security more generally. But increasingly I've found myself looking into contemporary forms of militant extremism, particularly groups like incels, the alt-right, et cetera, et cetera. And I think I'll be kind of speaking to that tonight, my question.
Hi, I'm Stuart Bender. I think at one point I would have identified as a film historian, but now I've moved more into specialising, I guess, in how do screen representations, video games, virtual reality, cinema, these types of things, how do those representations of violence impact audiences in particular ways? So perhaps tonight we'll be talking about some of those forms of media. And I have a strong opinion about how much a film historian should say about social issues. So we'll see how that goes.
Thanks, Stuart. I'm Susanna Castleton. I'm a creative practitioner, an artist, and I come to tonight, as well as my practice, with a very deep interest in cartography and mapping, and particularly in relation to mobility and how we actually are able to or not able to move around the world. So some of my creative practice is very large-scale prints and drawings, often with kind of a durational aspect, which involves usually quite a lot of travel as well to quite distant locations. And I've worked quite a lot with military aircraft most recently as well. So there's kind of a couple of threads that might be interesting to tonight's conversation.
Cool, thank you. So the theme of this panel, which interestingly, this panel was going to get together last year, and this symposium was cancelled because it was in April. And when we were planning this, obviously we were, predicting COVID would happen. And then I looked at the actual theme, and I thought, I wonder if I should update it, make it more kind of today. And then I thought, actually, it's even more kind of pressing a question. But it's a very, very broad question. I wanted to keep it sort of broad so my colleagues here right across the school from the different disciplines could talk to this one question. But I want to actually start off. So the question is, do humanities disciplines today need new ways of thinking about war? So I wanted to actually start with something quite specific. So I'm going to read this out because there's a lot of detail in a very short space of time. So I want to talk particularly about one very recent incident. So in 2020, whilst the world was largely preoccupied with the COVID-19 pandemic, war broke out in Nagorno-Karabakh on the 27th of September, which is a small disputed territory claimed by both Armenia and Azerbaijan. Nagorno-Karabakh is in the Caucasus, which is a mountainous region between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, which was once part of the edges of the Soviet Union. Armenians are predominantly Christians, and the Azeris are predominantly Islamic and ethnically Turkic. In the global politics of today, Azerbaijan is allied with Turkey and therefore NATO, a member of NATO, and Armenia is a member of the CTSO, which involves Russia, Belarus, and other post-Soviet states. So ethnic and nationalist tensions were largely suppressed under the Soviet Union, and after its collapse in 1991, Nagorno-Karabakh was at the center of one of the lesser-known ethno-nationalistic wars to break out in the 1990s. I think we all remember things like in the Balkans. Between 1991 and 1994, the war there actually killed 20,000 people and 1 million people were displaced. With the ceasefire in 1994, Nagorno-Karabakh was left as part of Azerbaijan, but largely controlled by Armenia. Hundreds of thousands of Azeris were permanently displaced from Nagorno-Karabakh, and it was resettled by mostly an Armenian population. There's since been flare-ups. There was a 4-day war in 2016, and in recent years, Turkey has begun supplying Azerbaijan with weapons, including high-tech military drones. And in September last year, Azerbaijan pushed into the region, and by the 8th of November, captured a key town of Shusha. By the 9th of November, 6,000 people had died, including civilians, and a ceasefire was brokered by Russia, who was part of a deal to move then 2,000 peacekeepers from Russia into Nagorno-Karabakh, asserting a strategic stake in territory now controlled by Turkey's ally. The reason I start with this particular scenario today is that it touches on so many of the themes around conflict that concern us in the humanities, right across the different disciplines of the humanities. The conflict has in part played out on social media and on the internet. Al Jazeera reported on a video that went viral on Twitter, which was shot in the shelled ruins of a cathedral in Shusha, of a cellist playing a piece entitled Stork, which was composed by Komitas, who is an Armenian composer who survived the Armenian genocide and later died in a mental hospital in Paris as a result of the trauma. The video is suggestive of history repeating itself. The conflict also demonstrates something of the asymmetrical power of war today, where drone technology is a decisive factor. The conflict is also part of the wider rise of ethno-nationalism in the 21st century, a century in which political subjectivity has shifted from the ideological in the 20th century to the ontological in this century. The conflict is also an example of the weaponization of history that often happens with 21st century conflicts, in which past events beyond the temporal horizon of the lived memory of today are rehabilitated to justify tensions that can lead to military action. And of course, this is often the weapon of strongman authoritarian leaders, which we've seen rise across the world in recent years. And finally, it reminds us of some of the perpetual old age features of war, the deaths of non-state actors such as civilians, the trauma inflicted upon individuals and groups, and the strategic gameplay that happens between larger powers over local political solutions. So before we go into more, before we kind of span off from here, I just want to ask, firstly, Dr. Ben Rich about how this more regional conflict might resonate with conflict and politics today. Ooh. Yeah.
That good? Yeah. All right, thanks, Kit. So from my sort of perspective, I think, we can, the first thing that everyone was talking about with this conflict, and like this was a conflict that I think many of us weren't even aware happened, or it sort of seemed to blur, as Kit said, into the malaise that was 2020. I remember we actually came up with this discussion we had in this hall when we were kind of prepping for this, and everyone kind of was trying to remember when this occurred. But while we were watching it unfurl, one of the things that we noticed initially was that this seemed to be kind of a standard Eastern European conflict, that you had two sides equipped by sort of former Soviet bloc military tech out of the Cold War, and that this was going to either be something where it bogged down very quickly, as it had occurred in 2016, or that it would drag out into a long kind of attrition-based, slowly eroding at each other's capacities. And in the first week, that's exactly what appeared to be happening. We saw the casualties of that conflict. They were quite one-sided. There wasn't a clear, decisive victor. But something happened in the second week that really changed the entire dynamic of the conflict, and in many ways resolved the conflict that had been dragging on since at least the end of the Cold War, so 30 plus years. And this was the very deliberate and widespread deployment of drone technology. We had seen in previous conflicts in the lead up to this, whether it was the 2008 Georgia War, whether it's what we've been seeing in Libya recently, that drones have played a role, particularly in asymmetrical conflicts involving the United States, but never this decisively. The Azeris, with their sort of oil money, were able to buy huge amounts of drone tech from both Turkey as well as Israel, interestingly enough. That was actually where their best stuff was coming from. And using this very, very decisively. So this technological aspect, I think, is something that everyone was very focused on initially. But I think, interestingly and importantly, in terms of the way we are changing our thinking about this, was how the Armenians prepared for this and reacted to it. This wasn't unexpected. You could go back and load up an IISS report from 2018 and see that these areas were investing significantly in drone technology and reforming their military around that. And if you were sitting across the border in Armenia looking down the barrel of this, you would probably think you'd want to actually do something about this. You'd want to change your patterns of behaviour and response, change your tactics. But what we saw on the ground there was that even once it became very clear that the Azeris were implementing this technology in a very decisive way, the Armenians kept engaging in the same sorts of behaviours previously. So they were, doing things like massive force, this idea that you push all your units up in a very small amount of space and break through, as this kind of Soviet doctrine during the Cold War. Now, this makes sense in that kind of previous iteration of conflict that we're thinking of. It makes it a terrible idea if you're talking about dealing with remote munitions that are flying around, for 2 days at hand, just looking for targets and then dropping on you. And what this meant was that once this occurred, the war very quickly turned in the favour of the Azeris, and they were able to basically get a resolution of that conflict that left a lot of that territory that's been a point of contention between those two countries ever since the end of the Cold War. So I think one of the things that it sort of illustrates is that the old ways of doing things, these patterns of behaviour that we've gotten very comfortable with, I think as across much of society, as these disruptive technologies come in, people will hold on to them. Think about this, if one is a historical example of this, go back to how battleships were perceived before World War II, before the invention of the aircraft carrier, and the ways in which countries invested huge amounts of capital in these ships and built their entire doctrines around them. Then a few Japanese planes fly over Pearl Harbor and change everything overnight and force a massive rethinking and an adaptation. And in that, some people survive, forward thinkers who are able to adopt these kind of practices and implement new ways and strategies of dealing with this, they survive, and other ones are kind of culled down in that new way of thinking. And I think this is something that is definitely being very much illustrated in this particular conflict, this very remote conflict that many people hadn't even heard of. But I've already been hearing people from talking over in the United States and the Defence Department here that they've seen this, and they're looking at their own forces. We're here in Australia when we face down what's happening with our neighbours up in China and stuff like that. Their own appreciation of this type of disruptive technology is very much becoming apparent in their doctrines here, and I think people are starting to wake up in response to that. So this is my opinion.
Cool, thank you. I just want to move then the conversation on to thinking about the visual and the way in which we schematically think about conflicts visually. And it's a pity I don't have that slide, because the map, when you look at the map, it actually looks pretty much like a Venn diagram, with Nagorno-Karabakh kind of sitting in that midpoint, and that being this point of tension. It's similar also to Kashmir, when you see Kashmir depicted on maps. So I wanted to start thinking about this idea of the way in which we start to think about mapping and conflict.
Yeah, sounds like my kind of word. And it's interesting, when we had a quick chat a few weeks ago about this panel, we were talking about a particular conflict, and so I went straight back to my office and did some homework. And of course, the first thing I turned to was to try and find a map of that location, because the way in which I think we understand things is so often visually, and certainly from when it comes to war, it is one of those things where these boundaries and barriers that are sort of sometimes drawn on maps can obviously have such a massive impact in terms of the actual territoriality of that line, but also in our own way of understanding it. And I think particularly with the huge amount of footage that we get to see from drone warfare at the moment, that kind of mapping overlay with this aerial attack method overlay as well, I think we're becoming very perceptive to and aware of the way in which this kind of bird's eye view of conflicts is kind of permeating our every day. And I think one of the things that, responding and kind of reflecting back on Kit's original question about the humanities, and I think being kind of part of this visual, this world of visual languages, I was reflecting on the work of a fabulous Belgian artist called Francis Elise, who did a great work called The Green Line. And he actually walked the Green Line through Jerusalem, the line that was drawn originally on a map in 1949. It was kind of the armistice line. And this was kind of drawn in a rather rudimentary way with a green wax crayon on the map, kind of to signal this armistice. And it wasn't until many years later that Francis Elise actually did this performance work called The Green Line, where he walked with a can of green paint with a hole punctured in it along the very same track that the green line on the map was actually drawn. And part of the discussion, the narrative around this amazing piece of work, is Francis Elise saying sometimes the poetic can become political and sometimes the political can become poetic. And I think that's really opens up a space for us in the humanities to sort of think about that political poetic kind of balance that I think Francis Elise was really looking to in that work. And I think too that from my perspective, being interested in cartography in general, that the kind of improbability and impossibility of what a line actually means on a map. The green line was actually squelched on this 1 to 2500 scale map, was actually equated to about 40 to 50 metres in the real world. So this idea of that kind of the authoritarian gesture that one can have on a piece of paper that then actually equates to real humans and real lives on the ground. And the people that are then consequently displaced because of that mark of a hand, I think is really interesting. So when we talked about this war between the Azerbaijanis, that very location, the conversation that, well, the particular research that I did on it was all about these kind of, and it's a huge mountainous range, and so the way in which this map is then having to be reconfigured because of the conflict and the pushing and the pulling, and then the way that particular access roads were made between Turkey and back into Asia. It was a very, very interesting way of kind of bringing together this sense of, I guess, the enormity of the way in which a map can actually, the enormity of the impact on the actual civilians, particularly who live in those spaces. Yeah, it's interesting.
I think it's very interesting thinking about these questions of mapping and where we draw borders, and so many borders created through these fairly arbitrary drawings on a piece of paper.
And then there's this idea that with digital technologies, those borders get drawn more exactly through GPS mapping and through satellite technology and so on. And it's interesting to see the places where that's not true. So thinking about areas where, depending on where you're searching from, Google will tell you that a particular place is one or another part of Cyprus, or they'll label Kashmir in different ways. Thinking about the ways in which Airbnb, for example, is handling where they will and won't allow you to rent places. And there was a lot of pushback saying that they should not be renting places in the occupied territories. And they ultimately pushed through. And so they have these designated areas that they sort of recognize as Palestine, but if you look at the map on Airbnb, only Israel is named. And so even though there's certainly an element of exactness in the way in which these digital platforms allow us to see borders, there's also a blurriness there. And right now that blurriness is deployed so that platforms can claim that they are neutral. It's deployed so that it is meeting the interests of those platforms so that they can continue to function in different countries with different rules and different understandings of their borders. But if we're thinking about the imagination of the humanities and imagining other futures, I wonder about ways in which we can take that blurriness that digital technologies enable and use it to imagine blurrier boundaries, to denaturalize this idea that borders exist, must always exist, will always exist in particular ways.
That conflict as well leads me to the next point that I wanted to ask about, which was to do with the impact on non-state actors and civilians, and the way in which we think about that and how we can think about that differently in the future.
I mean, I suppose thinking about the various sort of conflict situations, I'm particularly interested in looking at communities and how non-state actors actually seize upon different tools to create new stories about themselves. So, for example, one of the case studies I look at is the 1965 mass killings in Indonesia, where 500,000 people were killed and many more imprisoned as part of an anti-communist pogrom in Indonesia, and how the next generation create new stories about that past and new artistic works. And so when we talk about how we depict trauma, how we represent trauma, how do we do that when a lot of trauma scholars argue that, that the cataclysm of the Holocaust and so on are unrepresentable, and it's very difficult to talk about these pasts? And does it take a certain generation, the second and third generation that have been removed from that violence, into actually being able to depict some of those things? And what are the challenges of not knowing only scraps, knowing things in a belated way, as we've conceived about the idea of post-generations and post-memory. So for me, it's looking at when states fail, how do non-state actors come into play in terms of where do they pick up the pieces, what kinds of stories do they put together? When we think about Art Spiegelman's Mouse, for example, and depicting the Holocaust through that lens, there have also been efforts like that in Indonesia to depict things through animation, animated films, graphic novels and so on, in a way that's distancing in terms of the experiences of trauma that's been experienced by people very directly, and talking about that in a bit of a distant fashion by doing that using devices like animation, for example. And also just thinking about how, the increasing importance of actually when the state's doing nothing, how do you actually make sure that things continue to get remembered, people's lives continue to be valued, and if the state's not going to give compensation, what kind of compensation might that take shape? And whether it's in East Timor or in Indonesia, it's increasingly about the value that your community provides you with, the hearing that they give you as groups of marginalised people, of survivors of political violence, even to be able to be heard, for new memories to be surfaced, that can be a really powerful way of speaking about violence and being able to survive and move on. You know, and we talk about talking cures versus silence, and to what extent is it an agentic silence? You know, are people exercising agency when they use the device of silence? And that's certainly increasingly the case in the scholarship. And it's a tension, I think, of how to represent violence and what do we do in doing that. What can art provide in terms of communities and individuals making sense of what's happened to them, and ways of moving on, ways of marking pain, ways of resurfacing new memories, and so on. And so it's a really fertile area, particularly when states are not taking the action that they should be to provide redress for the past.
It also feels like the other end of the spectrum there is the immediacy of new technologies, with people expressing their, you know, being able to see what's happening in real time. And I've seen multiple people in Palestine over the last week saying that, you know, this is ethnic cleansing happening right now, and we're speaking about it right now, and we're sharing this information right now, and what is being done about it. And these platforms, social media, people who might otherwise be posting about very normal parts of their life, and their lives are then disrupted, posting on Twitter or Instagram or TikTok or whatever, talking about the violence that they're experiencing, the fear they're experiencing, and their hope for something else. And then also the ways in which that platform mediates that. Like, yes, those voices are getting out there, but different policies have different content moderation forms, and there are many people talking about material about what's happening in Gaza disappearing or being put behind blocks or particular hashtags not showing up, and all of that is often relatively opaque to users as well, because these are big for-profit platforms. We don't understand how their algorithms work, and so users are trying to navigate that space without being able to actually see what becomes visible and why and what doesn't.
I think there's also, this is maybe not a changing of perception of humanities. I think maybe this has been quite established view in much of the humanities for a long time, but I think there's certainly a changing sort of perception zeitgeists in more the general public as to what war represents and who experiences war. I think, you know, when was the last time we had a good war? You know, maybe Afghanistan at the start, if you want to stretch it, but I think we have an entire generation of people who have grown up with these endless conflicts, which clearly have no clear purpose. You know, there's this kind of vague notions about spreading democracy or spreading women's rights, which I find always hilarious when they talk about this in Afghanistan, because it's still rated the second to last global representation of women's health or whatever that is. So how much have we actually achieved there? But I think there's this airing away of the sanctification of war. And I think, you know, we're very aware of this here in Australia with the recent debacle around the Special Air Service personnel in Afghanistan, you know, and the way we used to create these kind of sacred cows around these issues, that increasingly people are willing to contest the goodness of these things in the public. And I think, you know, we only have to look to last week in Gaza, where, you know, the Israelis went on an absolute, you know, blitz of propaganda to try and talk about this as if it was good. And it seems to be even in stalwart bastions of support in, you know, the US Congress, there is an increasing contestation of these norms. I think the other thing that's really interesting also is too, as areas in which conflict was very sanctified, it sort of seemed as the real sort of staunch supporters of this, you know, if you look at video games and the ways there seem to be some openings in how conflict is actually portrayed in video games, whether we talk about, and you can probably talk me out with this, Stuart, there's this War of Mine, which is about a civilian living in a war zone trying to just survive. There was a video game a few years ago that was basically based on Heart of Darkness. It went through the plot line of that in Dubai, and very much an anti-war kind of experience which forced the player to essentially engage in like war crimes and sort of then deal with the PTSD fallout of that. And I think if we look probably most recently, there's this kind of controversy around this game called 12 Days in Fallujah, which was meant to sort of expose players to the experience of being a Marine in Fallujah in 2004 when they went into that city in Iraq, very full intensity conflict. And I think if this had happened, you know, in a sort of a previous generation, people would be getting all revved up for this. It was actually previously tried to put forward in sort of the early 2010s, but it was shot down because of the outcries of veterans groups, essentially saying, oh, this is not living up to, you know, it's just representations of veterans, and it's kind of, you know, making light of that. But the interesting thing is now this has been engaged in a second controversy, but this is now around the erasure of the experience of Iraqi citizens, and the fact that, you know, if we're going to talk about this incredibly destructive conflict, and we're actually going to get into real world conflict, where are the voices of the people that really suffered and experienced this full on? Why is it we just focus on the soldiers of an invading military rather than the civilians of that country and the citizens of that country who were on the receiving end of that? So I don't think there's going to be a massive change anytime soon, but it's interesting that these conversations are increasingly opening up and being had, and people feel comfortable having them in that more public space, whereas I think, you know, this might have been something you talked about previously, but you certainly wouldn't want to be posting about it on your social media.
Stuart, let's back it up and talk about a good war, because that's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought about the games angle that you mentioned, but it is interesting in a parallel way to the history of the war genre of cinema, which is typically that you make a movie about a previous war during a present war, and you make the film about the previous war using the attitude that you have towards the current war. That's the traditional sort of history of this stuff. And so typically you will get films made about World War II during the Vietnam War that start to question it and take on absurd themes about World War II, because that's kind of the zeitgeist time in society around the Vietnam War. And then as things move along, you start to get films made about the Vietnam War that foreground trauma, because those films are made during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. What is really peculiar is we don't actually get that retrospective view of World War II in films. World War II is almost always depicted in Western films as the... If you make a World War II film now, you're unlikely to deal in great length with trauma. It will appear, because that's part of the zeitgeist now, it appears here and there, but you're not going to get a narrative all about it. But if you make a film about World War I, you will foreground trauma, which is a recent film, 1917, essentially tries to foreground trauma through this main character, even though the film itself doesn't really do much of a job dealing with it. That becomes a part of this main character. So World War II is kind of, I forgot the word you said, not a bit sacred, but there's something about it. But it's interesting about the video games, because video games resisted emphasizing trauma for quite a while, but now we're seeing it. And the recent Call of Duty had an entire sequence where you go through a traumatic recreation of the traumatic re-experiencing the main character has, and you sort of witness hallucinations and so on, which is the sort of thing that we've seen in films for decades, but video games are now exploring that kind of aesthetic. I want to think more on that.
That's really fascinating, because I wasn't aware that changed. I remember like around, you know, the Call of Duty games, probably about 10 years ago, which were primarily really kind of a training brand more than anything. And it's quite interesting that, because one of the things I've written about recently myself is the way in which trauma has entered the sphere of entertainment and has become quite a mainstream drug of that. You know, so it's really interesting hearing of that particular development in gameplay, because I wasn't aware of that.
There's been some very interesting depictions of it. Whether they're meaningful or not is another question, but they're very interesting aesthetically. And game players seem to be struggling with them. They write about them, and they write about, you know, in blog posts and so on, attempting to understand why am I going through this. And not in terms of I think it's bad gameplay,
Yeah.
but nobody has not noticed this
Yeah.
change in the gaming community.
Yeah.
It also seems like indie games, maybe the economics of the games industry have a little bit more space to explore these things where, you know, if you're not making something that requires a huge budget, you can explore that. I think Papers, Please was one game that where you frustratingly go through the process of trying to cross a border and trying to get the right documentation and trying to do the right bribes. And that's a much smaller scale game, but, you know, obviously told from the perspective of somebody who's experienced or experiencing war, but, you know, not from any position of power. So I think that those games are often the spaces where more interesting perspectives sometimes emerge.
You have to, I think you have to kind of go you either do the indie route or you kind of go guerrilla route, which the game, I still can't remember the name of it, but it's this one where you engage in war crimes, and then the rest of the game is basically your mind unraveling as you hallucinate and sort of deal with the way that this came about. Was essentially what they did is they picked up an existing IP, they developed the game, and then they stuck it in there and sort of got it in around the producers and stuff. And so when the thing released, people were sort of confronted with this very challenging thing, and they're like, what is this? This isn't what I expected. So you see people still writing about it today as a kind of very important moment in that evolution.
Can I just pick up on something you said before, Tim, Ben, about our own kind of engagements with conflict as a nation, and I guess that privileged position that we have in terms of the distance in some way. And I was just thinking then, quite a few years ago now, I had to make a war memorial, and it's kind of a challenge to know how to memorialise war. And it was for the centenary of the Anzac landing, and so there were some kind of strict requirements that I had to have Ataturk's statement sandblasted in granite, and I had to have, you know, all sorts of those kind of, lest we forget, all of those kind of tropes that we associate with kind of our engagement with that kind of very important conflict in our lives. And I worked with mapping, and I retraced some of the trench lines from Gallipoli on the ground. And so there's kind of a lot of bits and pieces, and I had Dave Wilson actually wrote a beautiful statement for peace as part of it. But it just got me thinking about kind of our distance in some ways from conflict. And as much as kind of the whole experience was quite terrifying in some ways, but it was quite sort of, it felt quite big to be part of this. One of the sort of peripheral parts of this project was that they had sort of this big arc, just over Canning, the city of Canning, this big sort of amphitheatre arc, and across it they've got all these plaques that we sandblasted in all the conflicts that Australia has been involved with, so the Boer, various, all that. Unfortunately there's some spots with some blanks, which I always found kind of challenging. But we actually managed to have the very first plaque have two words engraved on it, and it was settlement conflicts. And I just think for us as a nation, and for me as an artist, to be able to have those two words on that one plaque, I think actually really did allow me to understand what conflict was for us as a nation and for me as the artist. So I think there are ways in which we do have to understand conflict that perhaps isn't in the kind of tradition of war. But the fact it was part of an Anzac War Memorial, I felt was a very a big part of that, even though it was this kind of small little plaque. So yeah, that distance I think is interesting.
Yeah, and it's interesting really about if you think about that, how the way in which how Australia's wars are bracketed, and that is looking much further back and troublingly towards the future. Yeah. I wanted to ask when I think about a lot of recent war art, I think about, for instance, the thing that comes to a lot of people's mind in Australia is the war art of Ben Quilty from about 10 years ago, and how he attempts to depict the PTSD of veterans. And I just want to ask, you, Ms. Vannessa, about how can creative arts actually empower veterans
I suppose in one way, like when you mentioned Ben Quilty and the depiction of veterans' trauma, and I suppose it's turning it the other way around, which is going back to that issue of agency again, about veterans showing agency in how they use creative arts. And I think we're seeing a lot of movements in that in recent times. Like now we have the establishment of this Australian National Veterans Art Museum, which is, it's an established charity looking at how the arts can actually provide a means for veterans to express their trauma, to communicate what's happened to them. And then, the Napier Waller Art Prize that the Australian War Memorial provides, for example, which the last year's winner was someone who had been deployed to East Timor, and he'd experienced homelessness, and Matt Jones. And it's really interesting how it can provide a really important outlet for veterans in speaking about what has happened to them. And another one of the shortlisted artworks in the Napier Waller Award was one by, I think, Steve Wilson, who he was interested in drawing because drawing's very focused his mind and stopped him experiencing some of the effects of trauma from deployment. And one of the scenes that really haunted him was a scene where he was from a village, a border village in East Timor, where people were, there were mass graves established in this village because basically they were massacred by the Indonesian-supported Timorese militias, and he had always felt a great degree of guilt about what happened to these villages, that the forces he was part of Interfet, which was deployed in East Timor in 1999, that they didn't get to that village soon enough, and it resulted in these massacres. And so the drawing, which was shortlisted for the Napier Waller Prize, was him standing by this gravesite with a little boy, and they're both looking at this grave, and he recollected how he used to do this and how the villagers thought it was strange. Why was he doing this? What did it have to do with him? And it's about dealing with the guilt of the deployment, and some of the work that I've been looking at of dealing with veterans' trauma in East Timor is through this group called Timor Awakening, and they bring veterans to East Timor to meet with the guerrilla forces who had fought the Indonesians in that war, and to sort of understand trauma as something that's very much inserted in the community. That in East Timor, there isn't such a medicalised way of dealing with trauma, that it's actually been a lot to do with cultural resilience, like, weaving tais like this, for example, that's about expressing cultural survival and bringing the soldiers, the veterans from Australia with the East Timorese guerrilla fighters, doing mountain climbs, walking, finding the hideouts of the guerrillas and seeing how they have dealt with wartime trauma. It has been really valuable as part of that Timor Awakening program. So it's something that I'm analysing at the moment with the founders of the Timor Awakening program, is looking at how community-based trauma healing can take place. And of course then, making it possible for the veterans to then express themselves through artistic works when they come home, and to be able to have that community connection as ways of healing and dealing with trauma. So I think that the creative arts is really important, but I think that it's not used enough, and I think it's about how to enable the veterans to be in a place where they can actually feel that they can create these artworks, and what can be done to support them to be able to do that.
I did have a question as well about to what extent can someone who has not experienced the trauma of war actually then represent and depict trauma? Any takers?
I feel like often we get maybe this second-hand, third-hand, whatever, senses of trauma through the family, and maybe that is not quite what it is like being there, but those family stories are important. In preparing for tonight's talk, I actually called my father, who grew up in apartheid South Africa, to ask him about resisting conscription. He skipped the country. One of his brothers also skipped the country, and one of his brothers worked with the ANC.
one of his brothers went and served on the wrong side of the war in Angola and was very traumatized by that. And there's some absolutely terrible, horrific stories there. But I can see the way in which those have not been passed on to me by my family on purpose. And he was very pleased that I was asking him to tell these stories. And obviously I don't know what it's like to be there. I don't know what it's like to have the police knocking on your door or helicopters overhead, but those family memories seem really important to me in the ways that we pass them on. And I think there's like the mouse comic book that you talked about that represent those in ways that are comprehensible to others. Yeah. Art historian? I'm a movie historian.
Well, I have a different interest in the question than what the question actually is, which is how do people who have no experience of trauma understand that they are watching, whether it's in a film or an artwork or a video game or a book, how do they understand that they are watching someone exhibit PTSD symptoms or something? What are the, I guess, some of the cliches and some of the tropes around this?
You're talking about the aesthetic devices themselves that are used.
Yeah, and there's the shot of the person looking in the mirror, and then that motivates a flashback to what they experience, and those sorts of very obvious things that haven't really moved on. I watched a film the other night, which was really welcome in some ways. It's called Sentinel, and it's about French soldiers being deployed around various areas of France in sort of 2014 to basically keep watch for inevitable terror attacks. And the key character is a female veteran who clearly has PTSD, and it's clear that she has PTSD because of the various flashbacks. We get associational edits of, we see her looking at a child with child's arms outstretched, and that motivates an instant flashback to her apparent experiencing, or pre-traumatic experience in Syria, where there was a child with their arm outstretched that turned out to be a suicide bomber. So we see these same tropes, even though the film is trying to do something else with it in its use of the character or anything else. That's its book. So I'm interested in how an audience member doesn't really know anything about this, thinks they know a lot about it. And thinks, I'm seeing a traumatized veteran here, and has no idea when they walk around the real world about these things, because they don't see the ways that PTSD can have functional impact, like what motivates someone to crack a beer instead of going out and interacting with the world. We don't see those things in art depictions very often, really, because they're maybe not as visually interesting to look at, which might be why, but it means that we are not getting a realistic representation of this stuff.
Yeah, I think there's an entire field across the humanities, which has been heavily influenced by Kathy Carrott's Untitled Experience from '96, which talks about traumatic form, and she's particularly talking about in the context of literature. But she talks about taking from Freud's certain Freudian notions of trauma. She talks about how, crises and meaning, incomprehensibility kind of come to stand for the depiction of trauma. And, back in 1996, it was a really interesting and challenging new idea. But in some respects, it's actually become the formula. And not just in literature, but right across different forms of cultural depictions of trauma. I think. Yeah.
Also about how do you represent things which have taken place in a hidden way. So let's say with routinized slaughter, for example, if they are taking place away from the public gaze, how do you actually represent those kinds of things? And I think artists have tried to do that. A lot of the sort of post-generation artists that I've looked at in Indonesia have tried to depict human rights abuses, which have been more to do with the lack of visibility. Like, for example, with the mass rapes of Chinese women in 1998 in Indonesia, with the transition to democracy. The women haven't come forward. They have been, thoroughly stigmatised, but because of the double oppression of ethnicity as well as gender. And so the women have been disbelieved. It hasn't been depicted anywhere in visual forms. And that somehow, with the rush to visibility in the democratic era, that unless something, you can show the proof, unless it's visible, it didn't happen. And so there's a whole denial side of things in terms of what happened to those women in 1998, and nobody would dare sort of depict these things. The artist community themselves have done it in a very roundabout way, like representing women's corsets, for example, as symbols. But in terms of the 1965 killings, the post-memory generation, the post-generation have been doing things like that in a very speculative fashion about, the bodies floated down the rivers and, people being covered up with in plantations with, banana leaves and all sorts of things. And so they have been reimagining these kinds of things based on oral history work, interviews and so on. They're putting these fragments and scraps of memory together. So as you say, to what extent is something unrepresentable, wholly unrepresentable? Or is it possible to actually, is it vital, in fact, and crucial to actually surface some of these memories in visual forms? Otherwise, how do we pass on the information to subsequent generations? I suppose there are some other questions.
Just as an aside to that, this reminds me of, there was a British official war artist, Housen, who was sent to Bosnia as an official war artist by the Imperial War Museum and created a painting which was a sexual violence scene. And when it was then presented to the Imperial War Museum, they actually refused to take it. And their stipulation was made up on the spot, really, was that this was a scene that the artist himself, Peter Housen, had not actually witnessed. So therefore, they didn't think it was a true depiction of war. In a war that had, in a genocidal war that had been, particularly marred with sexual violence. So it's quite interesting that in that particular instance, there was an attempt to almost use a kind of an artistic, that's a little bit like how the Archibald requires, an artist to see, to meet with the sitter. It's almost that kind of ridiculous to say, well, you didn't witness this thing and therefore this doesn't form part of the official artistic record of this war.
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit of the fourth plinth in London in Trafalgar Square, which is a blank plinth, but has been activated over the last 20 years or so by artists being commissioned to put artworks on there. And the proposals are often really quite interesting, but they've generally sort of followed a similar sort of theme. But this is a celebratory place of war, Trafalgar Square, with Nelson's column in the middle. And one of the proposals from Jeremy Deller was a replica, in fact it might have actually been the real car, or replica, I can't remember, of a car that had been bombed in Iraq. And that was his proposal, and it was an incredibly kind of confronting thing, this exploded car. And it was absolutely, there was no way that they were going to allow that to happen. And you think, hang on, this is a space in which the commemoration of war is done in such a kind of noble men on horses way. Why would, anyway, it didn't fly. It was very much not to be seen. And one of his other proposals was even more poignant, and that was equally kind of silenced too. So it's almost like when there's this space in which those proposals could potentially be visualised, there's always that moment where it's too far.
Yeah, he did actually end up bringing the car over, and it sat in the, ironically then, given the Peter Housen story, it sat in the Imperial War Museum.
Yes.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk about something which we haven't really touched on, and I think it's something that all of us have thought about a lot recently, which is the notion of online extremism. And one of the interesting things, it fascinates me because, I'm in my 50s now, and it's only really in the last sort of 18 months that it's become apparent to me that there is an entire culture which is based on conflict. And it was actually, for me, the moment where I was aware of this really was in the aftermath of the Christchurch shooting 2 years ago. So I just wanted to ask a little bit around online extremism, because I think to a certain segment of the population, which possibly I represent, is that it is kind of invisible. It's not, clearly apparent. If you don't kind of live in a kind of an online environment, it's kind of invisible. So, who should I ask? I should ask Sky, our internet service person, a bit about online extremism. And the problem, I think, we're representing. How do we represent that? How do we, as people who are theorizing visual culture, actually represent something that's so difficult?
I think that probably one of the first things that's important to realize is that online extremism isn't this thing that just happens off in these dark corners of the internet that you'll never see. There's actually a really significant flow through from these fairly unpleasant corners of the internet, including sort of specific websites that are increasingly having to jump around as different hosts kind of say, we're not going to host you anymore. Things that are happening in Facebook groups as people are organising around various conspiracy theories or racist ideas, and the mainstream media. I did some research on the anti-fascist movement in Greece, looking at Christiarki and the opposition to it, to Golden Dawn, and all of the ideas that were coming out from Christiarki, like the pushback against immigrants, this idea of a violent resistance to immigration, were also being shared in the mainstream media, often sort of through this slightly different framing of, oh well, I don't agree with Christiarki's methods, but. And we see the same thing in Australia. The fact that Pauline Hanson is very regularly invited to appear on TV, on breakfast shows, and given a platform. And so, if we think of it as the sort of dark, perverse thing that's happening only off somewhere where we can't see, there's no way really to combat the spread of those ideas. But if we understand that it's often happening right before our eyes. It's often happening with a large platform, through newspapers, through TV, and that empowers people who then go off and engage in violent acts. That empowers further organising, like the far-right organising that we've seen overseas, but also here in Perth. And so understanding that flow-through is really vital to it. I think, of course, we also have to understand the role of platforms. There's been a lot of advocacy trying to push back at platforms and tell them to shut down the spread of hate online, especially after the Christchurch massacre. There's been feminists working for, decades in various forms online to try to get online spaces to be safer for women. And often the people who are engaging in misogynistic behaviours online, that spreads into the far right. And of course we also see the role of automated algorithms on sites like YouTube. You go and look up a science documentary and then it recommends some Richard Dawkins and then it recommends Jordan Peterson, and you kind of fall into this spiral through an increasing selection of extremist content. And so understanding how all of that works together is really useful for understanding what's going on. Well, I suspect you have things to say too.
So I definitely agree with Sky. You see a lot of reflection of what goes on in online content. I would add though that I think you often get an even more distilled and kind of extremist form of this when we think about kind of the proliferation of, something I think we, particularly when we log on, is it's kind of nihilism that's like embedded in movements like the incel movement, which I think is something that there are elements of that reflected in media, but not to the extent that we see them manifest in those online kind of contents. And I think the thing that really I've observed, I've worked in CVE spaces since 2011. so countering violent extremism, and particularly with a focus on online radicalisation processes. And one of the things that's kind of worried me that I've seen emerge in these spaces, in particular extremist groups around right ideology. Some of you may have heard of the group Atomwaffen, which is this bizarre kind of confluence of racism, extremism, Satanism. These people that are just about like burning down the society that we live in totally, is very extremist, accelerationist views. Is this idea of the conflict identity that was articulated by a scholar by the name of Michael Vlahos back in 2008. And what Vlahos was writing about at the time was he was talking about groups, in war-torn areas. So he wrote about it was like Hezbollah. But his argument was that you would get people emerging in these groups that did not see conflict or violence as an instrument towards a political end, as we typically understand terrorism to be. It is, we use violence to achieve political ends, just as the state uses violence to achieve a political end in warfare. But that the conflict itself comes to fulfill those identity needs. So it's not about using violence to achieve an outcome. It becomes the violence itself. It becomes this cosmic war, as someone like Juergensmeyer will talk about, that is never ending. And you can kind of see this in a lot of the discourse, sort of even in the lead up to sort of the post-Trump era, this sense that they were losing their hooks and they would never be able to hold on to power. It was just impossible, but the struggle must go on forever. And that worries me a lot when I sort of see, everyone kind of thought, Trump's been voted out, so all these elements will kind of dissipate, they'll go home, take their toys and go home. But the thing that really worries me as we sit here today is this emergence of people where conflict is never ending. I have nothing to lose. Let's just keep going. Let's make it worse and worse and worse. How do you engage in forms of de-radicalization? If there is, why would you ever want to go back to that pre-conflict form? And I think it sort of comes back to a lot of things we deal with, topics we're talking about here today with PTSD, where soldiers wrestle with these ideas of, I yearn to be back in the conflict. I hated it, but there's something deeply fulfilling about being there, coming back into society and trying to reintegrate. There's kind of something's changed in me that I can never sort of go back to. And I see this happening there, and that's something that I think is particularly acute in these internet spaces when you get into these very closed echo chambers where, at least if you're watching Fox News, you still have to go out and deal with your neighbours in a way that someone who is in these very closed environments may not have to deal with sort of in their day-to-day lives.
I saw this rippling Brendel.
Just your question and what Sky said just then. I mean, it made me really think that actually online extremism isn't just in hidden corners, as you said. I mean, as an Asian Australian, I really find that it's much more ubiquitous than just in these hidden corners, actually, particularly, after COVID and having lived in the Northern Territory and then in Western Australia, that, the experience of racism is actually so much more ubiquitous than something that's just hidden online or on Sky News that you can turn away from, that particularly with the experiences of our First Nation peoples, and just seeing, where the commonalities are to do with that. We see Black Lives Matter movement, and then we also see a big movement around Asian Americans now who are being targeted. That I do think that when we talk about online extremism, it's not something that's niche, that's just out there, that's full of crazy people in the dark web, and that it's actually everywhere. And it does become a really difficult thing to tackle. When you look at those Aussie posters, I don't know if people have seen those with people in the turbans and unusual depictions of what we think about as Australians. Like, for me, those kinds of counterculture and culture jamming type initiatives are really empowering for Asian Australians. I mean, I've been here for more than 30 years, and I'm finding that it's constantly the work of actually trying to gain acceptance and argue for your place in this society is just constant. and it comes and, you know, and goes in waves and cycles. And, you know, whether it's, you know, hashtag I'll ride with you and all sorts of initiatives like that is actually really important. And I think that, you know, with the rise of the right, that we're not just experiencing it, you know, in the mosques and in the, you know, in these hidden corners. Actually, it has permeated the sort of society that we're living in. And I think that as the humanities, you know, what are the challenges for us to actually not just be more inclusive, but actually think about the very foundations of this country and how it's been founded as a nation. I think that, you know, it's something that we've got, the big questions that we've got to confront as well.
Now, I'm just conscious of the time, and I did want to actually throw it open to the audience here if anyone has a question. Let's put your hand up and I'll rush up with the microphone. Hey, okay. Just great, fantastic. You're like me. Okay.
So talking about children born in war, and talk about visual arts, especially the mapping thing. So what would happen with them in terms of what they see visually? Because they're living and breathing this, and it might have come from generations. How can they compare it to what is normal?
I feel like Vannessa, that might almost be a question.
So yeah, I'm writing a book at the moment about. I'm writing a book about the experiences of East Timorese youth and children in conflict. And my partner, Jose, in the audience here, actually, some of it is based about aspects of his life growing up as part of the clandestine movement and growing up during the war of, you know, having to be on the run for the first 3 years of his life. And so it is about trying to understand, you know, how do you depict that, particularly I'm Indonesian and, you know, he's East Timorese. We've got all sorts of identity issues about, you know, having come from the oppressor nation, the coloniser nation, and how do I depict his experiences? And it's something we wrestle with in our household quite a bit about, you know, the boundaries of storytelling and what stories can be told. And I'm trying to come to grips with, you know, the how do you represent the experience of having been born in conflict, having, you know, gone on the run with your parents, surrendering, and your experiences of your country as being the jungle first and foremost, and then the camps, you know, the detention camps once you've come off from the hills, and joining the movement, the youth movement, and then coming to Australia by boat, which is the voyage that I'm writing about of his illegal entry into Australia in 1995. So as part of that, it's really about looking at the effects of growing up and having been born in that conflict. So perhaps, I don't know if I'm the right person to talk about it, but perhaps people who've actually undergone and had a lived experience of that could reflect on that, perhaps. Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to go back to the original question as whether humanities discipline today need to think of new ways in which they engage in war. I think you have all given amazing examples of how we already engage in war, but in a broader sense, I'd like to throw my own idea out there and hear the feedback on that. I think that in a sense, humanities disciplines need to massively re-engage in dealing with war, both in terms of research, as you carried out in a number of ways, but also in terms of teaching war. I mean, for me, being the son of parents who lived through the Second World War and whose own parents died in that war, I grew up in an environment where the one thing that was clear about my parents' generation, at least in the circles in which I moved, was that they would never, ever want to see another war. There was no doubt about it. Anything else in terms of solution to world problems was fine, but not that. And as I then moved through the generations myself and now see the younger ones, that knowledge, that memory is gone. There is no sense of the brutality of war. There is no sense of the fact that war is hardly ever a positive solution to anything. And I think that in schools as well as in universities, in many places, humanities has disengaged from the study of war and from exposing generations to the brutality of war. One way for me to answer that question is really about re-engaging, massively re-engaging, and engaging in ways that are visually and emotionally disturbing. There are amazing ways of doing this. We have spoken about Indonesia 1965. I used to show my students the documentary The Acts of Killing, which I'm sure Vannessa and several of you know, where people who actually committed atrocities were asked to reenact their own roles. And watching the impact of something like that is quite amazing. And this touches onto the question of whether you can actually ever truly capture or portray in one way or another something that you don't experience. But that kind of art form comes pretty close to that. It's the next best thing. And I think we should massively bring it back into our classroom and produce more research that does just that.
I think that one of the advantages that we have in our school is that we do have so many people who are dealing with aspects of conflict and war across the disciplines. I mean, when last year I was putting this panel together, it was, I mean, Stuart and I have previously worked on an ARC grant application, so it's where Stuart's work. But just the more time you spend just, talking to people about their research, you realise how this is such an important thing, and also at the same time, we live in a time where, it's a potential war with China is freely kind of spoken about as if it's a, palatable solution to any global tensions, which is just unbelievable, really. I'm just conscious of,
Oh. If we've got time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do.
So I feel like, yes, talking about the horror of war is very important, but also we have to disturb, as you talk about disturbing content, disturb those ideas that underlie it, disturb this idea that ethno-nationalism is inevitable and will always create conflict, disturb the idea that borders are always and forever there. Pick up on those histories of thinking about anarchists organising against war, which is not always pacifist, but there were anarchists who were trying to organise against the First World War, against the Second World War, as well as Vietnam. And there are those traditions that don't take it as natural that we will always see war over and over again. And one of the things that we can do is we can imagine a different future. And that can be done in so many different beautiful ways. Not just focusing on the horror, but focusing on what we could have instead. Looking at, for example, right now there are many people using a hashtag to imagine what a free Palestine would look like, imagining a future that looks different, and that is something that we can also do.
I very much agree with that need. I think also there's been a tendency, particularly in the sort of 90s up till today, of sort of the arts kind of viewing the issue of conflict as a sort of an icky thing that wants to tiptoe around and maybe not teach it. I think you see that with the lack of war studies in Australia in general. But I also, I have my own personal experience of that. You can use, these very powerful storytelling abilities to kind of humanise conflict. I use in the unit I teach on terrorism, we go through a kind of first phase or module of the unit. We talk about these things in very abstract terms and sort of theories of political violence and stuff like that. And then halfway through it, I drag them back to ground to sort of remind them, actually, no, this involves people. So we walk through a 30-minute sort of blow-by-blow case of the Beslan siege, which I think some of us will remember was this thing in Russia in 2003 or 4, which was, in my view, probably the worst act of terrorism in history, where a group of Chechen terrorists took over a school in southern Russia and ended up killing around 350 people, most of them children. And the way we do that is we sort of use a combination of storytelling and imagery. These really powerful images that came out of that. And the kids will walk out of that rooms like not a dry eye in sight. And I think that's something that we need to sort of remember. This is the other thing I think is that the teaching of war studies and conflict studies has often been, this very big strategic studies approach to things. And I think that has value, but it needs to be grounded in reminding of the human cost and experience there. And I think oftentimes it's been seen as an either-or thing. And I think the ways to get the information best across, to understand the severity of that, is to find a balance between that, and not just turn it into a game, not just turn it into, this is all human tragedy, but a combination of the two.
Now, just, we have about 5 minutes left, so we have one more. Francis.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the really excellent discussion. And I appreciate the interdisciplinary makeup of the panel and the different perspectives that provided. I was just thinking about, in terms of the last question, in terms of the comments that it received. A few weeks ago, I was at the cinema, and in the adverts preceding the film, there was an anti-domestic violence advert that's being rolled out across Australia, I think, at the moment. And it was immediately followed by a recruitment advert for the Australian military. And the anti-domestic violence advert talked about the importance of teaching particularly young men the importance of boundaries, whereas the military recruitment video presented the Australian military as largely a peacekeeping, technocratic institution that engages in clean and surgical war. And I just wondered whether or not the visual culture of war is radically changing, not only to reflect the fact that drone strikes means that we don't have the sort of opportunity to fetishize individual acts of cruelty and heroism, but also in the sense that militaries, particularly in the West, are becoming aware that young people might be, cynical and unsympathetic about war, and therefore there's a need to present the war as war and the military as something that's much more clean, sterile, and professional. But I that's my outsider perspective. I just wondered if that's something the panel is, would agree with.
I don't feel like military recruitment has ever focused on the dysentery.
I think that point you talked about, it's not actually, I was actually talking to someone earlier today, it's this kind of weird paradox we have at the heart of our society. On the one hand, we say violence is bad, don't do violence, we teach our kids that violence is almost universally bad, don't get into fights, but actually there's a very special kind of violence that's actually very good. And I think that has all sorts of flow-on effects for, particularly in this context where we have, sort of this crisis of masculinity and how to define ourselves. That just adds further sort of ambiguity to that, and that's my one takeaway from that contrast.
It's about the acceptability of war. I think that Vannessa was just talking about, that we've actually normalised war a lot. Like, I think about growing up in Australia pre-John Howard, about, the way we thought about Anzac Day, for example, and how now the thought of, groups of young people going off to Gallipoli draped in Australian flags, for my generation, that's just so strange that I think we have stopped questioning. We have normalised this situation of war, we've accepted it. And I think that's, while on one hand we've got lots of veterans in our community now that we have to deal with the legacies of war, but at the same time, does that mean that we accept the fact that those veterans have come back wounded and we are now having to deal with that as a community? So yeah, it's a great example of how we've actually sanitised war and made it acceptable. And I think as the humanities, as Umberto rightly pointed out, we've actually got to problematise that and talk about the messy experiences of war, from the dysentery to the dangers that people confront and who we are bringing back as a result of war. I think there's some of the contributions we could be making through the things that we're teaching and researching.
I feel like another thing we can do is get away from this dichotomy of either talking about combatants or civilians. And we do very little to talk about people who refuse to go to war. We don't tell those stories very much. We talk about veterans when they come back. We talk a little bit about, but we don't talk about draft resistors, except I feel in the context of Vietnam. We don't talk about people who didn't want to go to war in World War I or World War II or any of them. And I feel like emphasising that, thinking about, there were groups during the Yugoslavian conflict who were working really hard to get men out of the area so they wouldn't have to fight. If we don't want any more wars, people have to say no to going to those wars, not just at the government level, but also at the individual level.
Finally, we probably have just enough to go.
Susanna, it wasn't really, it was more just reflecting on Francis' comment. I was thinking that the Brereton report would have had a bit more longevity in our consciousness. Like it sort of came out in November last year or something, and I think as a way in which some of those dichotomies kind of speaking about, that heroizing on one hand and then the kind of atrocities and even that idea of the subject and the object, who are these, when is a civilian, but when are they actually the object to be killed? I think that there's a lot of thinking to do around that report that I don't know if it's been done by the Humanities yet, but I feel like there's a space to look into that.
Well, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panel tonight, Stuart Bender and Susanna Castleton. Thank you so much.